I think for you that are here, most of these men need no introduction. Some of you that are online may not know all the names here, so let me just do some quick introductions here. Let's see, on the far side here we have Dr. Nicholas Miller from Andrews University Theological Seminary. He's the chair of the Church History Department as well as the director for the International Religious Liberty Institute, and he of course has been our main speaker here for the weekend. Welcome, glad that you're here. Next to him is Elder Daniel Xisto, and we can call you Elder. Your ordination was, let's see, 2 weeks ago, is it? Something like that, yes? Daniel has been a pastor in the Potomac Conference for 5 years now. And Daniel is not only a thinker about world events and current issues. Oh, yes, each one of you should grab a microphone there. Yes, feel free. Daniel also had front row seats on something that was important not just here in the Valley, but actually on the international political stage. Last year in August, there were riots in Charlottesville. And I know that up and down the Valley, people kind of turn on the news like, well, wait a second, that's Charlottesville, Virginia. That's just down the street, basically, from our little neck of the woods. And what happened there was certainly politically significant, and it does have potentially some religious liberty overtones. And so, Daniel, we thank you for being here and being willing to share your insight and experience with that. Next to him is Dr. Klebert Feitosa. Dr. Feitosa is assistant professor of physics at James Madison University. James Madison University is just down the road from us, about 20 miles south in Harrisonburg, and owns half of that city, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Sprawling campus, growing place, and the home to tens of thousands of students. Klebert, you have been there for, is it 8 years now? And Klebert thinks deeply on a variety of topics and is a faithful Seventh-day Adventist teaching on a secular university campus. And so Klebert is going to be able to share with us some interesting insights into how what the impact on religious liberty is. What do you do when you're in that type of an environment? What has been his experience as an Adventist in that type of environment? Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And of course, Elder Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and longtime contributor on places like 3ABN, other channels, specialist in the area of religious liberty. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here on our panel discussion. We are going to spend some time here. I have some questions, and I have shared some of these questions with our panelists in advance so they could be thinking about these particular issues. You will undoubtedly have questions that come up yourself. Good news, at around the 3 o'clock mark, we are going to have a couple of wireless microphones here, and I'll ask for a couple of volunteers at that point to be a rover. And you can raise your hand and you can ask our panelists what your question is. I would encourage you to write it down. So, as so often happens, you think, oh, I want to ask a question about that, and then 40 minutes later you've completely forgotten what it was. So feel free to take out a piece of paper and to write down your questions. Our panelists are here for your edification, and so please feel free to participate in that process. Just a reminder to our panelists, there's a wealth of wisdom that is here. There's not a wealth of time. Be powerful and encompassing in your answers, and remember that there are 4 of us, and that we do have, there's a wide array of knowledge that we're hoping to convey to the congregation. So without further ado, let me start here with a softball. What, in your opinion, and I'm going to open this up to anybody that would like to tackle it, what, in your opinion, is the greatest religious liberty issue or challenge facing us today? Wide open. Who'd like to tackle that?
Well, I'm not as experienced as my counterparts here, but from my limited experience, I would say that a great challenge with religious liberty is the conflation of religious liberty and Christian liberty. So in other words, people thinking that religious liberty means advocating for Christian rights only. And so I think a misunderstanding of just the general definition of what religious liberty is, that it's for all people and all faiths, not just Christianity.
Interesting. I see some nodding heads here on the rest of the panel.
Greatest enemy is complacency. Adventists who have been champions, I think, have been forgetful. Let's just be kind of what we once believed and held. Christians in North America with a constitutional tradition. I seem to have forgotten it, and we're in the midst of, I don't know how to characterize what we're in, but it's a threat to every civil liberty. When you have a statement that the president can kill another member of government and pardon himself, you're in mortal peril for every liberty. And it's all being done in a Constantine-like wave of the hand over a Christian practice. And we've also forgotten that there are other religions, as was said, but other Christians in other parts of the world. They're being killed in large numbers, and doesn't move most people. So,
now, I'm curious, do you find this to be a situation with Adventists in North America, or is this also in other places in the world?
It's in the Western world.
In the Western world in general. Okay.
So I was going to say that it's a hard question to answer if you don't qualify it in terms of geographical scope.
Okay.
Because what threatens religious liberty here in the United States or North America may be quite different than the threats overseas. So in North America, probably the greatest legal threats to our institutions and our members is presently left-wing gender and sexual extremism. Law school in Canada is fighting for its very existence because it has Christian lifestyle standards for its members and the students and faculty. And the bar organizations of Canada are saying, if you graduate from that law school, we will not recognize your license. So you're basically telling a Christian institution that it has to shut down because its professionals will not be recognized.
And be specific. What are the criteria that is so troublesome for the government not wanting to recognize?
It says it has sexual standards for its students, that only married couples, heterosexual married couples, can engage in sexual practice. And so you can't live together out of wedlock, whether you're male or female, and you can't be in a gay relationship and be part of the school. And so do we have the right? This isn't about imposing these standards on society or those outside. This is about, can the Christian community continue to operate institutions and organizations that hold its values? And it's a real problem because you see down the road what happens in communist countries. It wasn't that they took all the Christians and put them in jail. They did put some in, Christian leaders and whatnot, but effectively you make it so that Christian young people, you can't have Christian schools, and if you won't go to school on Sabbath, then you can't go to university. So a whole generation of Christian young people are essentially denied higher education, the ability to get into the professions. It's a way of marginalizing and sidelining a community. And you can see the early stages of that beginning to happen in some very secular-minded countries like Canada, and in some states within North America that are more liberal in their outlook, perhaps California. We came very close last year in California to schools that had Christian standards not receiving any government scholarships or funding. Not the schools, but the students attending those schools. There was a very real question whether we could continue to operate institutions, school, universities in California or not.
Now, let me interrupt you for just a moment. That was not only an issue in California. In the 2016 election, there were administration amongst some of our universities were concerned because of the potential for a Hillary Clinton win, because she had been very, very forceful in her support of mandating LGBTQ rights for any institution that was receiving federal funds. Now, obviously, the election did not go her way, but I am curious, for you and for the rest of the panel too, is that an overblown fear that the promulgation of LGBTQ rights is a threat to our churches and our schools? Is it overblown, or is this for real? Is this something that could actually come to pass in the near term?
I need to say, I agree with Nick. I mean, obviously, we've even featured that Canadian case, and Canada is aggressively pursuing this line. They're very secular, as is a lot of Europe. There's several levels I come at it. First of all, we've been told some of the story ahead of time in great controversy, and it's conservative religionists that are the original threat. Plus, if you look at history and the history of this country, you know that conservative reactions are generally more to be feared, and we're in the middle of one now. And so I felt for a long time Christians are rising to the wrong bait. And a lot of this, as Nick knows very well, a lot of it is about government funding of religious activity, which is a threat if you don't toe the line on getting into the gay agenda. But for us to set it up that it's either religious rights or gay rights, not a very good construct. But I believe, and this, I've got very little evidence other than the patterns of history, but we're headed in a bad direction. You can see it already. The stress is coming, natural calamities, great controversy, spoke about it. There's going to be a conservative reaction. And as in Germany, I believe in-your-face gay activity, secularism, anti-creationism, all the rest, it's going to disappear. It's going to be criminalized. And I believe that the gay movement has signed its own death warrant. Think about the last election. In my view, what did it for the Democrats was the optional toilet policy. Everybody, even the gay community, were horrified at that. They overplayed their hand. So yes, we're in a wicked and an immoral time, there's no question. But we shouldn't get sidetracked on this. It's procedurally very problematic, and a lot of good Christian lawyers are defending on this, and it's not a threat to be taken lightly, but it's not the main game.
Well, now, go ahead, Dr. Feitosa.
I do agree that one of the greatest challenges that we have as a church is how we stand with the LGBTQ agenda. And I do think that one of the challenges that we have is to answer the question whether providing those requests or protecting their rights, is that equals to supporting their lifestyle? And it may not be, right? I may be providing a service, but not necessarily agreeing with what their lifestyle is.
So you're saying that may be a potential way for Adventist schools to maintain federal funding while still accommodating to some extent?
There will be people that would be not very happy with Christian schools depending on federal funding to operate. That's one issue, right?
Federal funding is not a religious right.
Yeah. Now, I do think, however, that it can be used in a way that promotes religious ideas so that other liberties are taken away. Right? So you can give federal funding just for those that practice a certain type of religion, for example. And in this case, you are discriminating against the other people.
Well, I'm curious. It's a very good point. But Lincoln, I'm sensing that you're saying, well, let me back up here. Let's be clear. Most of our universities, for instance, Adventist universities, if they lost the ability for their students to receive federal aid.
It's usually actually state aid that's the issue. There is some federal funding, but in California there's Cal grants. It's at the state level where, and it's not, to be clear, it's not funding directly to the schools, it's funding to the students who then can use that.
The government tends to see it the same way at the end of the day.
It would have a fairly profound impact on enrollment.
Yes,
I think is what I'm trying to say. And,
yes, it would.
And Lincoln, are you hinting that maybe it's time for us to be weaned from that? Is that what you're? Is that the solution?
We've created. I don't know how this got turned off.
Oh, did it get turned off? No reflection on your comments, I'm sure. Let's see. What's the secret, Brother Bill?
You know, the record is very plain, almost from the beginning. The Religious Liberty Department has warned against the entanglement that comes from taking government money. It's not a moral issue, but it's an issue of poor judgments, and we've delivered ourselves into the power of, in this case, a government that's pursuing an agenda that compromises our faith. And there's questions of supplying. Even on North American campuses, will the church supply dormitories for gay married students and things like that? That's all comes along with taking the state aid. But the problem is taking the money and being unwilling to give up the money. A lot of this would evaporate if we were not, trying to be in bed with the government. as their sponsored agents.
Dr. Miller?
Well, I'm sympathetic to this argument, but it doesn't really take into account the reality of the last 80 years of government intervention, increasing government intervention into our society. So it used to be that churches would run colleges and hospitals all on their own. But after the 1920s and 30s, with the rise of the welfare state, and the government became involved in so many aspects of our lives, for better and for worse, that it becomes impossible in a sophisticated society like ours to run a hospital, for instance, without taking Medicare and Medicaid. The government has intruded itself, if you will, into spheres of life, healthcare, education, that we can now really no longer operate in those spheres without using the tax monies we pay that the government has chosen to fund that infrastructure. It would be, I think there's one college in the whole country that doesn't take any federal or state funds at all, right? It's at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and they have sort of a massive right-wing endowment that, you know, gives them tens of millions of dollars, and they're able to operate. But no other college can really practically do that, and I think that our church has somewhat pragmatically said, and following the advice of Ellen White, who stood against A.T. Jones in his sort of absolutist separation.
I was hoping you'd fall. I could have a good argument on that.
Yeah.
She made that comment on the Salusi College grant, and they deceived Ellen White. She said God still moves upon kings and princes to give the money. That was a particular case where Cecil Rhodes, a freebooter and a murderer, had kicked people off the land and then to get legitimacy, he gave a grant of land to our church and others, and handed over the government to the English Crown. And in the dialogues with Ellen White, it's obvious she didn't know, and the leaders, of course, were angry at A.T. Jones, and they said, "You always take A.T. Jones aside," and that he opposed it adamantly. If she had had any inkling that it was blood money, given her attitude on alcohol money and the slavery issue down south, I know that she wouldn't have gone with it. Yes, the principle applies, but you don't sell your soul for a government pottage.
Well, I prefer to think.
But you're right. Where you and I agree
the
on this very much so is we're in this situation now. And the church can hardly disentangle itself, and we do need to seek solutions and stand on our religious rights and hope for the best. But we're already in a compromised situation. Even the comment, which is true, about the government intrusion into every part of life, that's part of the devolution of the Republican system of government. It was never intended. None of us quite realise, unless you sit back and look at it objectively. Even some of the commentators now are using terms like, like Italy, fascist. We're in a fascist state. I mean, it's not like Italy, but structurally it is not the pure, simple, democratic representative government we had once before. The government's into everyone's pocket. It's controlling, and clearly we've delivered ourselves into its power.
That said, Dr. Miller, I'm curious, is the solution you're suggesting, particularly with regard to lifestyle issues, gay rights, etc., potentially intruding onto our institutions, is it just go to court, do the best we can, pray, work to preserve our ability? Is that what you're saying?
Essentially, and we're not on our own in this. I mean, most religious colleges from most Orthodox traditions, whether it be Catholic colleges, other Baptist and evangelical colleges, even Muslim schools, I don't think they have those at the university level. There are some Jewish colleges. Most of those organizations hold to a similar biblical Judeo-Christian outlook on marriage. And if we band together, not on an ecumenical movement to all worship together, but to protect and preserve these fundamental liberties for our institutions, I think we can meet and beat back that particular religious liberty challenge.
Dr. Feitosa, good.
I think that we should be careful about what is imposed on us. And in some ways, it comes to my mind what we read in Matthew chapter 7:12. So do unto others what you want them to do to us, right? In every way. Evidently, some people have chosen to have a different kind of lifestyle that we disagree with. But I do think that providing a service or refraining from providing a service just because of that lifestyle that someone has chosen might not be the criteria for us to stand.
That provides a very good segue, if I may.
Okay.
Within just a few days of us sitting here on this stage, there has been a Supreme Court decision regarding a baker and his business in Colorado, and determining whether or not it was legal for him to deny services, as you're referring to here, to a gay couple, in this case two men. Let me just open up in general. What are your thoughts about the decision of the Supreme Court? Is this a definitive decision? Is this merely a stopgap, and we're going to see this again next week in some different shape or form? Anyone on the panel?
Well, I follow this fairly closely, and I'm on a listserv of law professors across the country that have talked about this continuously and nonstop since the decision came down.
So you may have something to share with us.
Well, I
today.
may.
Okay,
I
good,
may.
Good.
And the question is, so there was a 7-2 vote, which was unexpected, because the court is divided rather sharply 5-4 on these kinds of issues. And yet the 7-2 vote was achieved by making the decision itself very narrow. And there wasn't a general pronouncement that religious convictions are going to outweigh LGBT rights in all circumstances or even most circumstances. This case, the courts below, the commissioners in Colorado, had been particularly disparaging, I think it's fair to say, of the religious beliefs of the baker, had compared his religious views to those of slave owners and the Nazis, and said some other rather extreme things. And so the court said, in these circumstances, where the state has so obviously been not fair, that we're not going to allow religion to be disregarded like this. And yet, if this was really such a narrow decision, I would think that they would have sent it back for a review under a fairer analysis. But they didn't. They reversed it. And so it does suggest that there are many people who are arguing it's a very narrow decision that only applies to these facts. But I don't think that's quite true. I think what they have said is that when religious freedom and LGBT rights come into conflict, that there needs to be a fair balancing and appraisal of both sides. And I think that's right. I mean, that's a view I can get behind. I don't think the religious conviction should always win. I don't think the LGBT right should always win. I think it should be a facts and circumstances test, depending on the level of intrusion, the level of indignity, the level of care and concern, that one side may win and the other side may win in different circumstances. As to your point, I do think that it should be made clear this baker was not discriminating against individuals based on their sexual orientation. You can read a number of his editorials he's written about this. He was happy to serve and sell gay persons things from his store.
Cupcakes, yeah.
What he was just unwilling to do was to actively use his creativity to bake something especially for a moral choice that he did not agree with. So it wasn't, this is how it differs from not serving blacks or Jews or Catholics or Irish. It wasn't about who they were. It was about him not contributing to a public moral choice that they were making. And I think that's a different thing, and I think it's something we need to be sensitive about in a pluralistic society.
So you're saying a one-size-fits-all approach it would be a very blunt instrument, it sounds like, to deal with these types of...
Too blunt for a complex situation like this.
Daniel.
I'll also add to this discussion, not so much in terms of the Supreme Court decision per se, but the fact of our brothers and sisters in the LGBT community having rights. And I think we are in this situation partly because there was a point where they didn't have rights. It was illegal at one point, in some countries around the world today, if you're known to be in that community, you could be put to death. And so I think because, and maybe the church has contributed to this, there has been an abuse of rights where this community now has come together and says, hey, we are human, we deserve basic fundamental rights. Perhaps it could be argued if those rights are superseding religious rights, but it seems like religion has been king for so long. We've had absolute sway, especially in the Middle Ages, that we have been the bully. And so now that the one who has been bullied is saying, please stop bullying me, and say, well, now you're taking that too far. So I think it's just important to realize that there has been a history of abuse, and that all of this is maybe coming about because of that abuse.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a complex thing. As far as the Supreme Court, I don't think anybody watching it thought they were going to turn against Christian rights. And in my view, I'm just an observer and I read this stuff carefully. Apart from a few things like Dred Scott and the peyote case of a few years ago, they don't really step much out of line. They're trying to dance around this stuff. And you know, they have largely a religious sensibility. In fact, it's a Catholic majority court, even though the different strains of political thinking. But it's worth remembering, and in line with what you're saying, I forget the names, but there's 2 or 3 very well-known evangelical leaders who have gone to Africa of late, cozied up with the political leaders, and it's a bright line. It isn't just they are associated with it. They suggested to these African countries these extreme penalties that included the death penalty for gays. And the political leaders in these African countries have said it was suggested to them by the right-wing religionists from the US. In lectures for years I've been pointing out there's an undercurrent in political Protestant thinking in this country of the Christian Reconstructionists, Dominionists as their lighter form, and read their stuff. They want the most extreme penalties against gays, Sabbath breakers and so on. That's what I'm saying. That's what's looming. It isn't that gays are going to sweep all Christian sensibility out of the way. They might want to. The gay movement and all that it's part of goes back to when I was a kid. I remember them railing against the patristic society and we want to get religion out of the world and all the rest. Of course that's part of the agenda. But I just do not believe gays are the problem, even though it's a sign of great moral degradation. And this Baker case and most others like it bother me because it's a sanctimonious attitude. You're a leper. Where if you're running a shop, you have to know as a matter of certainty that every day through that door come wife beaters, child molesters, thieves of one type or another. It just happens because a limp-wristed,
But you don't bake cakes celebrating the child abuse and the molestation and the criminal conduct.
It's a setup. We all know it was a setup because they wanted to provoke a reaction. In the real world, photography and cake making, you go where there's simpatico, right? If they'd come in the door and the guy said, thank you for coming to my business, but you know, I should tell you up front, I'm a committed Christian and you know, my Bible has things to say about your lifestyle. And I'm glad you came here, but I have to tell you, I may not be the best person to do this. And if you still want me to do it, I'll do what I can, but I really can't invest myself in this. What's he done illegal? Nothing, right? But to say, I can't do it for you or won't do it for you, how does that comport with Christ being accused of carrying on with publicans and sinners and all the rest? We've got to be around them but not partaking of their sins. Writing a birthday or decorating a birthday cake in as officious a manner as it can is not a compromise of faith. It shows that you sympathize with their humanity.
That's what your conscience says, but are you open to...
And it's worth remembering that on religious liberty, it doesn't matter what your church says. If you are deeply conscience-bound on it, the law is set up that it has to respect that. Absolutely.
And other consciences feel differently. You know?
I think we experienced something similar
during the Obamacare debate, when there was the mandate for them to provide contraception in several hospitals, of Catholic orientation,
Right.
were refusing to do that. And I do think that each case has to be analyzed individually. I cannot refuse from teaching physics to a gay student. I cannot think of myself doing this, right? Because it's a service that I provide. And in many regards, we have to think about discrimination. So,
Final question before we move on to another topic. And this is definitely within religious liberty milieu, but at a very practical level. If someone here were to say, okay, I understand that. There may be times when I need to provide services, for instance, teaching or something like that, to somebody that I profoundly disagree with their personal lifestyle. What would you suggest to help the thoughtful Adventist be comfortable doing those things when appropriate, while at the same time not condoning what they see as very damaging and hurtful and ultimately sinful behavior? How can that be done? And just a little more color on that. This is where I feel like often religious liberty discussions run aground. Because we can talk in theory, but the fact of the matter is that there are people that are bakers and physics teachers and with real people in real places. And so it's a real challenge. What would you say to them? How can they draw that line in a way that it's meaningful?
I just would like to start saying that Jesus was criticized many times because he went to have dinner with sinners, right? I mean, did that mean that he actually approved of the behavior of these people? Certainly not. And his interactions with them and his presence made a difference. And they saw that difference in many situations. So I think that one of the things that we should really think carefully about is that approving of the behavior of someone is not equals to providing a service to someone, or being in association of friendship with that person, or receiving them in church and so on.
If I understand what you're saying, tell me if I'm right. You're saying that providing a service to someone that you may profoundly disagree with what they're doing, while being a genuine follower of Christ, that witness may be what helps to draw that line clearly? Is that an accurate summation of what you're saying?
I think so. I think you
Okay.
can have your conscience clear about what you believe in, and at the same, isn't that what Jesus says? He provides the sun and the rain for righteous
The just
and
the
unrighteous.
unjust, yes. Yeah.
So is he condoning the behavior of the unrighteous? So.
Good point. Elder Steed and then Daniel.
Try to connect other dots. Now, this discussion veers dangerously away from what I think all of us here understand on religious liberty. We are called to defend the rights of any number of belief systems and non-believers, no matter how unpalatable that is to us, and even die to defend their right. Why is this grossly different, as long as we're not participating in their sin? Admittedly, and I haven't even passed it out yet, the Old Testament does have a supreme condemnation of enabling witchcraft. And you might be in your conscience think that this is modern day witchcraft. There are times where we're not to have anything to do with an activity. But I think on the religious liberty model, on the Christian charity model, we should be very, very careful, and we've had articles in Liberty lately, of creating a pariah class that even if we get the law on our side, that's a bad thing. I mean, think of Nazi Germany. They did it to a whole class of people. They were corrupt. Their music was corrupt. I mean, go and study the history. Even a form of music was ascribed to these Untermenschen that was banned in the country. We have movements in the United States that are largely under control, but given half a legal right, they will bring in some pretty severe stuff in this country. And I think we need to allow this openness. It is a bad sign that we have such open homosexuality. I believe, wait a while, it will be forced back into the shadows.
Elder Xisto.
I believe, I agree with what Elder Steed is saying, that if I'm understanding him, there's a stigma attached to LGBTQ that it's like we can't even go near or associate whatsoever. And it's like we all, I think, and I would hope, we have friends and family members who go to church on Sunday. And we understand Sunday as one of the main things that's going to be associated with the mark of the beast. Yet we treat our Sunday friends and family absolutely fine and normal. There's not a stigma attached to them. And so if they invite us to a worship service, we might even go because they said, oh, my nephew is being whatever confirmed, or we're having a baby dedication, or this or that. And so we will go and stand next to them. They know what we believe, but we're treating them as we would want to be treated ourselves. So I think the golden rule goes a long way in finding that line that you asked for.
Thank you. Let's transition here to our time is of course flitting away as we predicted. So let's look at a couple other things here. You are sitting in a sanctuary that is in not the state, but the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we are often referred to as a purple state. And you're in the valley, and that means that generally, in spite of the color of the pews here, that this is generally a red area. And so Republican Party has great support in this part of the world. I am curious, what are our panelists' thoughts on the level of identification currently in Western Adventism today? Let me just stick with the United States. With Adventism in the United States and one party or the other. The polarization in the general political discourse, it seems at times to have bled over into the Adventist church. You can read various magazines online put on by either end of the spectrum, and it does seem that there are some particularly, for lack of a better way to put it, Republican Adventists. There are particularly Democrat Adventists, both with differing agendas. So I'm curious, do you find that to be a phenomena? If so, is it concerning? And how should Adventists deal with a rather polarized political environment? You have 30 seconds. Dr. Feitosa.
Summer of 2014, Pew Research puts 35% of Adventists as Republicans, 45% as Democrats, 19% doesn't say their affiliation. I think this might be a little bit different here in the Valley.
Pew Research Center.
Pew Research Center. What bothers me perhaps is that the polarization that we see outside of the church has in some way entrenched our quarters also, and it has become more and more difficult for us to have civil conversations that involve some sort of politics. It's like talking about sports, right? And this is a bad sign for democracy in general. I think that the society in general is treating politics as you treat sports, right? If I'm a Red Sox fan, I'll die, even though they lose forever. They didn't, they won a couple of times, so this is good. So we shouldn't treat it that way, I don't think. We should think more about the political discourse.
What's very interesting about U.S. history, it started off with no political parties, and most of the participants didn't want parties because they didn't like the Whig and the Tory thing in England, but they soon developed. What's also interesting in U.S. history, once the runner-up used to become vice president, so you'd have a president of one party, the vice president of another. What's also interesting, the Adventist Church went through a period where people became very partisan. It was the William Jennings Bryan era and the gold and silver standard. And Ellen White said, very interesting, on at least 2 occasions, he says, any pastor or teacher who's involved in partisan party politics should resign or be fired. We used to have a great caution about direct political action or identity as far as the church. Individual citizens, you're right, it's even almost an obligation to become somewhat civically involved. But when the church gets involved, or when, as the body of the church favors one or the other, you got trouble. And that statistic, I think, is a bit misleading, because there's no question in North America, if not a majority, then a huge block of the Anglo membership seem to be reflexly sympathetic to the Republican Party, which of course has come to embrace religious rightist agendas.
So I was just going to say the numbers fluctuate over the years, and I think that they break down among different demographic segments within the church. So the figures I saw from a few years ago was it was more like 60% of Adventists were leaning Republican and 35 or 40 Democrat. But I would say the numbers in the Anglo community, it's probably around 70% Republican. But among the minority communities, African American is going to be 90% Democratic, right? And so we do have a real challenge in terms of having divisions within our church based along kind of racial political lines. And for me, that's why it's so important for the church and the thinkers in the church and the leaders in the church to start defining more carefully a biblical view of justice, so that we are not dependent on one party's view or another party's view, but that we can say the biblical conceptions of sexuality, family, immigration and refugees, and we suddenly find ourselves with a platform which is not the same as either side, but which is distinctly Adventist or Protestant or biblical, and will help us within the church to draw lines less on partisan divides and more on biblical foundations.
So if, just to follow up on that, and then Elder Xisto, I'll come back to you. Are you saying then that it is definitely best if Adventists do not register as a particular political party?
Well, that's not what I actually said, but I'm not registered as for a political party. I'm an independent, but I am a teacher at one of our schools. I mean, the drawback of that is that often, especially in states that lean strongly one way or another politically, if you're not registered in the party, you don't actually get to help choose one of the candidates. And so you're depriving yourself of the meaningful vote earlier in the stage, and you can only vote in the final where your vote may not mean anything. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't register, but I think I would say if you register one way or the other, that should be almost your secret. People should know you as someone who can speak from a Christian framework and perspective, not from a Republican or Democrat or Libertarian framework or perspective.
Elder Xisto?
I was just going to add that, unfortunately, I think that for a vast number of Christians, and dare I say Adventists, that they get their worldview informed not primarily through the Bible, but through their favorite media outlet. That's where they make their major life decisions, and if it matches up with what the Bible says, well, that's a nice added benefit, but it should be definitely stemming from Scripture, and be it where it lands on whatever side of the aisle, that's just where it lands, but it should be rooted in Scripture. So often I think that it's rooted in their media outlet.
Interesting.
Can I make a final comment? Just a question or a comment, a thought comment. Seventh Adventist Church historically had very strong opinions against labor unions. And if you think on it long and hard, the objections to the labor unions were not so different from what could be the objections to strong political parties. How the parties work and maneuver things. In my view, in some ways, we're heading back to elements of the Boss Tweed sort of operation of the party politics. You think what happened? I mean, there's one thing that no one much talk about, but the information was being shared from the Democratic Party in this election. The guy that ran their computer system is shot dead in the street. You're dealing with a pseudo-crime operation. Not much different from, as Ellen White in her day spoke about the labour unions. I really think, as Christians, we need to be very careful of identifying with the operation of these. We've got to be involved in politics just by casting a vote. It might even be an obligation. But think about, you give up your autonomy, others make decisions of you, violence associated. These are all the things that we held against the labour unions, but they can apply to strongly run political systems.
Interesting. In a related vein, I'm curious, how many of you that are here this afternoon know about the Johnson Amendment? The Johnson
They're not
Amendment.
reading Liberty.
That's interesting. I think for those of you that can't see online, there was about 10 people maybe that raised their hand. The Johnson Amendment is actually part of the IRS code. How many of you know about the IRS? Excellent, excellent. Okay, much higher participation, yes. The Johnson Amendment is named after Lyndon Johnson, one of the former presidents, of course, of the United States. When he was a senator, this particular addition to the IRS code came to be known by his name, because he was the main sponsor for it. Basically what it did is that it prevented anyone with a tax-exempt status, for instance, a church, from actively advocating for a particular candidate in politics and actively raising money actively for a particular candidate. Now, does that ring a few more bells for people? Okay, a few more hands are up like that. Not being partisan at all, just talking about facts, one of the things that our current president, Donald Trump, has said repeatedly is that he will repeal. That's the word that is used even as frequently as a week and a half ago by Vice President Mike Pence at a national gathering of clergy there, to repeal the Johnson Amendment so that, in his opinion and what he said, that churches can be restored to and have their rightful voice in the political process. Is the Johnson Amendment a good thing to keep? Should it go? And is this something that Adventists ought to be paying attention to?
So our Parle Department has put out an official statement on this, at least at the NAD level, and has said that we oppose the removal or the repeal of the Johnson Amendment because we think that will create a dangerous incentive for churches to involve themselves more fully and directly in politics and political advocacy, not just on issues of morality, which we believe we can speak to, but actually on candidates. And the dangers there is there's a lot of money flowing to support candidates, and suddenly if churches can endorse them, you can send that money through churches using their tax-exempt status, and the whole mess that would create for both churches and the political world seems very dangerous. And so we've spoken against that.
They never came and asked me, but still.
Now's your chance. Now's your chance.
No, but we featured it at Liberty. It's a bad law that's accomplished a good thing. You can very easily argue that this was the wrong way to openly try to muzzle churches and other non-profits. It was done as payback by Lyndon Johnson because there were groups, including church groups, that opposed him for his re-election. But this isn't just about the Johnson Act. A decade or so ago, the evangelical churches were pushing strongly for the Jones Bill, which was to do the same thing. We ran an article on it then. They wanted, and still want, an ability to raise unlimited money for political campaigns, to advertise directly for a candidate, to bring them into the church, to do what campaign reform, finance reform acts tried to inhibit. I know lately with the super PACs or whatever, it's gotten out of hand. But they want the church to be a major political player. So that's what's at play here. And they're very close to getting it. It was actually on the tax reform bill that got through, but at the last minute it was pulled the day before, and I don't quite know why, but that was providential. So removing it in itself is not a great problem in my view, but what it represents, what it's, the wish list that it's enabling is not very good.
Well, help us understand that, and then we'll come to you two here. You say at the last moment it was pulled. What is the likelihood, in your opinion, of President Trump being successful in removing this restriction?
So he can't.
Executive order anyway.
Well, he can't repeal it. It's a legislative enactment that has to be removed by the legislature.
He could pass an executive order that accomplishes that, but he knows that's
Well, no, he can't. You can't overturn law with executive order. But what he has done.
An executive order that would effectively bypass it.
Well, he tells his Justice Department not to enforce it, which has a similar effect.
But I think they will get it because the general sentiment is to not restrict religion. We're in a time when there's. We're in strange. From the beginning of the time when I started with Liberty, I used to cite Tale of Two Cities, the best of times and the worst of times. There are threats to religious expression.
Swap again.
There are threats to religious. I must be pressing the wrong button. There are threats to religious expression, but at the same time, we've never had it so good. And the coalition that are riding Trump's broad and abusive coattails. This is their coming to glory. Religion is not being restricted in the US. It's unthinkable that they will be thwarted on this because he's made very grand and Constantine-like statements that he will enable and protect religious expression. And elsewhere we would talk about what it's narrow, it's entitlement for a certain group. But for that group, it's open go. So yes, I believe they'll get it very shortly, one way or another.
Dr. Feitosa?
I'm a lot more worried about what got us here. And I think the reason why there is even this debate about getting away with the amendment is that political operatives in the political right has used the hot buttons that are particularly important for Christians for political gain. And they see that segment of the population as a faithful group to rely on when elections come. If you can get rid of that restraint, then you can perhaps get even more people to join the conservative movement. And I think that's part of the issue, is the exploitation for political gain of the issues that are important for Christians.
Interesting. Elder Xisto?
Just wanted to add that whether or not the certain amendment is repealed or not, I think that in practice today, the church has a very heavy influence, as we saw in this past election. So practically speaking, it's happening all the time where pastors are endorsing candidates and they just, find their way through the law or whatever, and people might not even be looking at the law. So it's happening all the time. I received a call on the voicemail of my church, and it was from Pastor Rafael Cruz. And he was heartily campaigning for this person, Dunbar, who is, I guess, in this area. And he was saying that he and his son endorse this person, and that we as Christians are meant to be salt. So come to this conference that we are holding, where me and my son are going to be there, and this representative are going to be. And so I'm like, Johnson Amendment or what? I mean, this is like full-blown advertising.
It's true, but remember, there's a narrative. It's not long ago that there was an accusation that the IRS were being used to target some right-wing church groups. So they've had this fear, not always realized that the liberal group are after them. They have more control now. Remember also that Dr. James Dobson had to separate himself from Focus on the Family to set up a separate entity to protect himself against a possible IRS challenge. So it hardly has happened. Do you know of any case where they've actually gone after any church? But there is a fear.
Not for many years.
No.
It's happened a few years ago.
But I believe once the fear is taken away, they will act differently. It's not that they're doing what they would do anyway.
An intensification of it. Let me quickly move here to our topic here so that we can turn some time over to our audience here. As I mentioned in the introduction, last year, 2017, in Charlottesville, there were significant events that caught the attention of the world. The process of the immediate violence in 2017, it began, if I recall correctly, in May. The City Council of Charlottesville was going to make some changes to the name of a park that was named after probably one of the most famous figures of the Civil War, at least in the South, Robert E. Lee, and also to remove a statue that was there in that park. There were some legal challenges to that decision. One thing led to another, and ultimately, in August of last year, there were dozens of people that were injured, and one person was actually killed in the violence that happened there. In response to that, there has been a wide range, certainly in the Christian community and in the Adventist community, to what happened and what our enrollment, if any, our engagement with the events of Charlottesville and those like them, what it should be. For instance, some Adventists have said, we would be protesting in the streets too against racism, etc., but we're fearful that if we do that, we'll be next. Because Adventists, for instance, we have some odd things about us, and we know what the Spirit of Prophecy has to say, the Bible, etc. We're fearful that if we go out and protest against people that don't like one particular issue, we will be next on the list. What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I know Daniel's going to speak about this because he was pretty close to this situation.
He was, yes.
And I'm going to give him that room, but I want to say ahead of time that I'm very proud to see some of the students that I've had at Andrews taking issues of social justice and righteousness and religious liberty and putting them into practice in their ministry. And I think this is what Daniel has done very effectively. And as I look at history, and I see the civil rights movements, for instance, the reason the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was largely a peaceful event was because the leadership was overtly Christian, and the philosophy that undergirded the movement was specifically and explicitly Christian, civil disobedience in the manner of Christ. And sometimes we're tempted to say we need to stay out of these movements for justice. But if we do that, there's always more extreme elements that will come to the fore. And in fact, this was seen at Charlottesville. Despite all the negative publicity Trump got, and he shouldn't have said it, but there's some truth. There's some extremists on both sides. Now in Charlottesville, the provocateurs and those that caused the violence were on the right. There are extremists on the left, though. But if we allow the protests to be taken over by those extremists, our country will fill with violence and run with blood. And I think it's up to committed, dedicated, peace-loving pastors who are willing to involve themselves in issues of justice that can cause social change to happen in a way that is peaceful and positive rather than violent or negative. And I wanted to take this moment to thank Daniel for his service on behalf of his church and his country for being an Adventist voice down there.
Appreciate that.
Elder Xisto, please.
Yeah, there's this poem by Martin Niemöller, which says, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak." And so I think, as Dr. Miller has said, it's incredibly important for us as Christians, and specifically as Seventh-day Adventists, to have a presence and to show the world that there is a different way. And so in the aftermath of what happened in Charlottesville, exactly 1 week later, because the violence took place on Saturday and Heather Heyer was murdered on Saturday, exactly 1 week later, our conference, I was extremely proud, our church said, hey, we have to do something to respond to this, not by, getting Molotov cocktails and anarchists and burning the place, but we have to respond as Christ would respond. And so division and chaos was present, and we came in with unity, healing, and love. We came together, our church, the Charlottesville Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the Spanish church in the Potomac Conference, and we joined forces with the Allegheny Conference. And there was an African American church in Charlottesville, and there was also a Spanish church in the Allegheny Conferences. So 4 churches, 2 English, 2 Spanish, 1 white, 1 black, and we came together. And we all met at the African American church in the morning, and then we marched through the street with a police escort to our church in a unity march, and we sang "This Little Light of Mine," and we sang "We Shall Overcome," and the community was seeing how Christians respond to violence and hate and division. Very long story short, after we had this high holy Sabbath where 4 churches were just bursting at the seams in unity, after that we went down to where the violence took place, where the actual murder took place. And we were marching in unity there. We were all wearing red. And when we turned the corner to where the very location was, we saw a woman standing at the site, and she was weeping. And then it dawned on us that this was Heather Heyer's mother, marking the 1-year anniversary that her daughter was taken. So we hung back, and by this point, there was maybe 70 of us from church, but the community is like, hey, what's going on? Who are these people singing? So there was this huge bubble of maybe 300 or 400 people that had joined in our march. And we hung back as the mother wept. After 5 minutes, she turned around and she said, I think I'm going to need some support. And so 400 people just descended on her. We surrounded her.
The ultimate group hug.
We asked if we could pray for her. She asked us to pray, so everyone grabbed a shoulder. Someone put a mic to my mouth, and we started praying. And then we sang songs, and we had a memorial service for this person. And we, the church, showed Jesus to this woman who was grieving at the most horrible time in her life. And I think that is the thing that Adventists can contribute to this social justice and social disobedience, civil disobedience construct that we're talking about.
If I can sum up what I think you two are saying, done correctly, Adventist participation in social justice issues can work to preserve religious liberty rather than cut it down. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So this is a good example of overcoming evil with good, right? That we could sit at home when racists are in the streets and bad things are happening and ignore it, or we can come out and participate and engage and overcome evil with good. And this is a model of that.
Yeah, I think our response was the best you can do. You can't get involved in the situation. We can bring the calming spiritual influence. But as far as what's happened in the US, this is a very interesting time. I mean, we know what it was connected with. It's the alt-right agitations that were the undercurrent to the election. But I've lived in this country long enough to know that this is little stuff to what's happened recently. I mean, I was only a few miles away when Governor Wallace was shot in the election. What was it, 68? I mean, we've been through incredible stuff. But I don't like... Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen pictures of a Stalinist Russia where Joseph Stalin is standing by himself? Pictures where there used to be people next to him. We're rewriting history. And it just really aggravates me because it's making a convenient history that we can all agree on and taking out real facts. I'm not offended by statues of General Lee. He existed. The things that I would find offensive, if I grew up here I mean, I grew up, but if I was born here and identify with its history to it in the local way that people do, Stone Mountain. I mean, there's something that is an in-your-face reminder, but generally you have to take these historical memories. What if they went in Europe, every statue of a king, he was an evil king, rip it down. You can't change your history.
But Lincoln, have you considered when most of these statues were put up? Have you looked into the history of this?
So it's not settled yet. The Civil War hasn't been settled. Reconstruction was a horrible time, and we're still in the shakeout.
Many of these statues were put up at times surrounding the attempt to move back discriminatory laws in the South.
Period, yeah.
So in fact, you will discover that many of the statues of Robert E. Lee weren't put up shortly after the Civil War to, comfort grieving soldiers and their widows. But 75 years later, when minorities are beginning to perhaps get some legal rights, the town fathers and mothers...
They want to rewrite history.
Say, no, the town fathers and mothers put up reminders of the glorious ethnic heritage of the past. So are these genuine historical statues, or are they attempts themselves?
Of course they are. Every statue is an attempt to glorify that particular person. Unless it's pamphleteering or outrageous glorification beyond the reality. You're stuck with it. But it's like the Supreme Court, and they're dealing with the Ten Commandments and all the rest. They say they're ceremonial deism. What do they mean? Religious artifacts that have been removed of their meaning. We are only giving them meaning now. If you give the meaning back, you start the whole war over again. They're just the letters of history behind you. But you go back, and to try to rewrite history in a convenient way is not good for any country.
Dr. Feitosa, in the interest of time, we're going to give you the last word on this, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. Go ahead.
I think that we got to a time that people feel that there is some implications to have those statues there. I'm not opposed to not having the statues, but I think they have to be in a museum where you give them a context where they meant, who Lee was, what he represents, and so on. Now, if it's in a square and there is no history behind, people don't have that context, and therefore I think it's legitimate to take
I can take both sides
that.
of an argument, but just looked at it from an internationalist view. Here's a country, what happened. Unless you've got something so aberrant, in Germany, Hitler's stuff is pretty much erased. But I've traveled enough in the world to see everywhere you go, there's statues to someone not very nice person. They did something horrible. I mean, you've got a president now extols Jackson. I mean, he's pretty close to an evil personage if you're an Indian in this country. But, he's being lauded.
Native American.
You're going to try to have him removed from the lineup of presidents? You can't do it. But history should record, and I think it has done accurately, that the South had with it, it wasn't just a glorious lost cause, it had some horrible abuses, worst of which protecting an institution of slavery. I mean, that's been decided already now, but to reawaken it over a fight, the statue, it's a symbol, yeah, but if the meaning of the symbol's gone, then you have no fight.
So Dr. Feitosa got the last word, and Elder Steed got the epilogue.
I'm sorry.
So, no, that's fine.
Yeah, he's good at that.
Let's see. Could I have perhaps two of my dear local Newmarket folk come and be willing? Gordon, would you be willing to do one? If you have a question for our distinguished panel, you can raise your hand. I can almost guarantee you that we will not get to everyone. Thank you. Go ahead, Don, please. Thank you.
This is for anyone on the panel. Recently, particularly in Hungary and Poland, there's been an uptick in anti-Semitism. About every 70 years, anti-Semitism becomes a dominant theme in certain circles. Since we as Adventists have a health message, we try to eat fairly kosher. We keep the Sabbath, so we have some similarities to our Jewish brothers. Do you see this as any kind of indication that one day we will be lumped in with our Jewish neighbors?
Well, I'm not sure, but that was actually one of the reasons during World War II in Germany that the Adventist Church kept a fairly low profile and, as I mentioned earlier, turned over our Jewish members. We kept the Sabbath. We did all we could to distinguish ourselves from the Jews. That was certainly a fear we had then. And could it happen today? I suppose it could. I think the rise of anti-Semitism is just part of what I referred to earlier, this resurgence of Christian nationalism, which is a kind of Christendom, not a kind of Christianity. And it means that anyone who's not part of that narrative, whether it be Muslims or Jews, or remember, minority Christian groups like the Seventh-day Adventists. I saw Ben Carson was on our list to discuss, and you may remember at one point in the election, the name Seventh-day Adventist came up. And Donald Trump was actually behind, in Iowa, I believe it was, behind Ben Carson. And he went out and began talking about how he was part of the mainstream Presbyterian church. And Carson, what is he, a Seventh-day Adventist? I don't know about those, right? So this is...
The Jehovah's Witnesses are also being strongly persecuted, particularly in Russia.
In Russia. So this is an attempt to marginalize anyone who's not part of the mainstream, and it's not good for the Jews, the Muslims, or, if we think about it, the Seventh-day Adventists.
Hillary. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let's see. Let's do Dr. White and then Dr. Genus. Yes. Go ahead.
I want to talk about rights, because the term is ubiquitous in our discussion and in our society. And I like to go back to natural rights And, in our society, you have the right to health care, you have the right to free college, you have the right to get married. If we could back up to natural rights, and what are our panelists' thoughts about natural rights? And do you agree with George Mason, who said or wrote something to the effect that we are all born with freedom and with natural rights, and there's nothing we can do, no compact we can make to divest our posterity of them? Do you believe that we cannot divest ourselves of our natural rights?
Give a whole lecture.
Well, that's quite a theoretical question, isn't it?
Allowed a semester for the answer. I'm sorry, Dr. Miller.
Well, come to my meeting tonight at 7:30, and I'm going to talk about rights a little bit more. But your notion of natural rights is a good one. Everyone celebrates rights these days. Everyone has the right to the thing they want, it seems. And that obscures the historical classical notion of natural rights, which was a right was based on an obligation or a responsibility or a duty that you had. So your duty to God created rights against the state, but your duty to worship God had a corollary. Then the rights didn't come without some sort of responsibilities to go with them. And these days, everyone just wants rights without the responsibilities. And that's a particularly modern conception of rights, which begins to fall apart, because if everyone has a right and nobody has a responsibility, then the rights never get met or fulfilled. And I think we need a recovery of the notion of rights going with responsibilities, and it's not just something we're given, it's something we, in fact, exercise responsibly in relation to the transcendent and to our communities. And also, in a more classical definition, rights tended to be negative. I have the right to be free from government intervention. Now you're suggesting in the 20th century, I have a right to health care and a right to certain benefits from the government, which is also somewhat different, but may not be inappropriate under biblical perspectives of what governments do, but that's a separate question.
Maybe what you're getting at is Thomas Jefferson's comment that we have inalienable rights granted by, what was the term he used? Not God, but the
Creator.
The Creator, a deistic thing. But the other day, I did what I haven't done since I was in school, teenager. I read the Magna Carta, and I was surprised the language there is very similar. And that's at the dawning of the modern idea of rights and so on. And clearly, I need to go back and look at it, but I think where they were jumping off from was a Christian sensibility, even though the medieval church was not granting them much of anything. But this was appealing to, there's a creator God, and we have certain things, and they were wanting them, and the king for a while signed off on it, and then King John was hard to deal with. But even Thomas Jefferson and others connected, even though he wrote the Declaration of Independence and we sort of started with a fresh slate, they connected the development of rights here right back to English common law, and of course the Magna Carta is the main document on that, or a pivotal document.
Let's go over here.
Hello.
There we go.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this conversation. As leaders in the church, I want to get your opinion on this thought. I have been a second-generation Adventist all my life, so for the past 50 years or more, I've been hearing all about religious liberty and things like that. But as we go through life now with these various injustices that are coming up and different conversations that have been coming up, I don't hear anything as a congregant about what our church is doing. Why is that? Is there any explanation as to why most of us in this room knew nothing about the Johnson Amendment? Why is it? And it's not because we're not learned, because we don't look for it. We don't hear about it, and we don't hear what the church has to say. What's the church stand on homosexuality? What's the church stand on the social injustice of police brutality and standing or not standing for the national anthem? Those are all the things that affect every one of us in one way or another, yet as an organization, I don't have a clear standing as an Adventist on where I should stand with my church on this matter. I have my personal opinions, but where do I, as part of this church, connect with the organization as a whole?
I just want to start by saying I resonate with that. Even as a pastor, sometimes I want to know where our church stands on an issue. And so I am frequently on Dr. Miller's Facebook page because he is always talking about these things, but of course he's not the official voice of the church, just a voice, a very well-informed and balanced voice. It really struck me yesterday. I think, in short, say that we should pray for our church, our leadership, and us as members to become more involved. I was struck last night when Dr. Miller put the notion, that quote from, who was it, Jones and Smith, Uriah Smith, and how they were forcibly speaking against the war and what was happening and the brutalities happening in the war. And then he suggested, could you imagine this in the review today? And it's like, why have we lost that fire where we can talk about some of these things and be unapologetically Seventh-day Adventist Christian witnesses? I'm not sure, but I just wanted to say I resonate with that concern.
Can I speak to?
Certainly.
I'm really.
Let the physics professor handle the electronics.
You know, I'm not responsible per se, but I'm in the system that you're not hearing from, and I edit Liberty magazine, that we're printing about 3 times as many of them as Signs of the Times, and it's going to people, not Adventists. And that's beyond my ken. But a long time ago we decided to send our views to someone else and not remind ourselves. We should be reading our own material. There's Liberty, there's different websites, there's our own church website. I was going to be facetious before and say you haven't heard these things because you haven't put your hand up and hoped that our website would hit you as it went by in cyberspace. But we put these things out there, and the church is very wont to come up with statements. I know some of the people have put them together, and they're not really necessarily even representative, but they take it on themselves. They make a pious, meaningless statement often about what the church stands for. They really trouble me. You know, one of the things that we had, the Protestants had a beef with the Catholic Church were these ex cathedra statements. You don't believe something on an issue just because your church says it. What the church should be reminding you, and you should be fixed on, is what are the principles that it's based on. If you understand and have revisited the principles that convinced you to become an Adventist, you should know what our view would be on abortion and all these other things. You don't need to wait for the church hierarchy somewhere to tell you what their view on it is. And unfortunately, a lot of these statements, they're just putting them... they're just putting them out into the ether. I don't think these statements are nearly as important as that Adventists are seen to be sensitive and responsive. And back to on the social justice, I'm a bit scared of on one level, but yes, we need to be involved. We need to be socially responsible. If Adventists were known to be truly involved in the community because there's an outgrowth of what we believe, it would catch on. But, you know, PR programs when, you know, ask an Adventist or help you across the street, I mean, that's just a fiction if we go that way.
Well, I have a slightly different view on this, that perhaps am I free to share it? The church actually has put out some statements, and often you'll see them on social media, Facebook, the Review website, and there were statements made in the last couple of years over issues like DACA, the Dreamers Act. You remember when that was rescinded? The North American Division put out a very sensitive and fine, balanced statement about speaking up on behalf of our members and neighbors who might be threatened by this. I'll talk more about that this evening. They've also spoken out on some issues in relation to police brutality and injustice. There was a North American Division statement on that, and when that happens at the union level, we try to spread that through our conferences. I'm not part of this union and conference, so I can't speak to that, but we do find it important. And the role that I think these statements can play is not in telling us what to think, but in helping us determine what I talked about at my sermon this morning. We don't want to get involved in partisan politics, but there are some issues of real morality in the public square that we can, as Christians, speak to. Just like our founders spoke to temperance reform and prohibition, anti-slavery, do we not have such issues today that have significant moral components to them? And as church leaders, we try to sensitively think through these things, looking at principles in the spirit of prophecy in the Bible. Where can we speak out? Where can we make a statement? And if we do that, then it sort of, I don't know if enables or justifies, but it gives space to local church members to perhaps more actively become involved in that, right? We can't, as the church, we don't want to turn the church into a lobbying center where we work on environmental issues directly or peace and justice issues directly, because that's not the role of the church. But it can be the role of the church to help our members think through about what responsible citizenship looks like and to unleash them to be more actively involved in some of these issues. And we're attempting to do more of that.
Let's see. Let's go back. Right over here in the back. Yes.
This is for Dr. Miller. And it was just alluded to, you made a comment last evening that our Adventist pioneers saw the beast with the lamb-like horns speaking as a dragon in relation to the Spanish-American War and in relation to slavery. Over time, I've done a little bit of reading and a little bit of listening. I'd just like your opinion on whether the government may have been or is speaking as a dragon through the taxation system. Can you speak to the fact, the history of the personal income tax? Was it passed properly, etc.?
Well, I think Christ himself was pretty clear on this, in that he took a coin and asked whose superscription was on it, and it was Caesar. And Christ acknowledged that we owed certain things to Caesar, including in his own day, taxes and tribute. Now, so I think it's hard to say from a biblical perspective that just the fact of taxation itself is repressive, onerous, and speaking as a dragon. Now, is it possible for there to be oppressive and unfair tax systems and applications and policies? Yes, I'm sure that's true. But I don't think you can just say, because there's taxes, we're speaking as a dragon. And our pioneers, while there wasn't, the federal income tax comes later on, there were certainly state taxes that existed during our pioneers' days, and no one ever thought of challenging that or speaking of that as prophetically oppressive.
Yes, go ahead.
I read in a magazine, I don't know if it's true or not, of homosexuals and gays starting a Seventh-day Adventist church. Now, I can understand if it's non-acting homosexuals, but if they're acting homosexuals, the Bible says they're not going to enter heaven. My sister's a missionary, and she and her husband preach in Mexico. And one of those guys was a homosexual, and she started reading the Bible to him, and they were not entering heaven. He said, "Oh, I didn't know that." And he changed completely, so they...
Was that a question or a statement? I'm not sure. Was that? Oh, is it true? Okay, that's the question.
So
is it
there's
is it
no
true?
conference that I know of that has allowed a church to formally organize. I have to be careful how I state this. There was a non-employed former Adventist pastor who baptized an individual that was part of a same-sex marriage in California, and that was very controversial. And the conference issued a statement making clear that it wasn't a conference employee that carried out that baptism. I think it's fairly safe to say that all the conferences I know of, even the more, quote, progressive ones, have not allowed that to happen. And there's some rumors sometimes at Andrews University we have an LGBT club, and that's not true. What we do is we have an LGBT care group that was very carefully set up with guidelines to make it clear that the leaders of that group, it wasn't a club, it's not run by students, it's run by the faculty of the school, and they have a very clear mandate and commitment to operate that club in a manner consistent with the Adventist understanding of the biblical teachings on it, to provide, as Daniel refers here, our society, the bullying in the past, there is such a high level of drug dependency, of suicide, of emotional problems in the LGBT community that we need to minister to our young people who find themselves in that category. And I'm proud of Andrews University for taking this controversial step, because there's such resentment in the church about this, but the step has been taken very carefully in a way that we are committed to a biblically faithful approach to the question. And so when I travel, I usually try to speak on this because there are rumors about other things happening, and those rumors, I personally know at this point, are not true because I was part of the committee that helped set this up, and I'm in careful contact with the leadership of the group so I can speak like this.
Gentlemen, we are just about out of time. Do we have one more? I don't know who was in line. I see 6 hands. I guess you have the microphone, so you can go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
One's a statement and one's a question. I think first the statement, we have to be careful as leaders or in ministerial groups or when we're supporting or have support independent ministries, I should say. One of my friends who's not an Adventist has been supporting one of our ministries, and she got a call from them a couple days ago, and she used to be Republican, but she does not like Trump, the way he talks and the way he talks about women, his morals and different things. This man that called from this independent ministry, somehow he got talking about, and he got praising Trump, and then he got running down Obama, and she was shocked. She said, how can you as a Christian support someone that talks like him and treats handicapped people the way he does and talks about women and his morals? I'm not sure if she's going to support them anymore. So I think we need to be careful in talking to people and expressing our views sometimes. The other thing I wanted to ask, Dr. Miller in his sermon this morning quoted several texts from the Bible about hating. We should hate evil, we should abhor it, and I was wondering, does that go as far as hating gay people and treating them, with disrespect and everything? Someone else mentioned how Jesus sat with sinners, prostitutes, and ate with them. And I thought, that's the way we should be, shouldn't we? I have a friend I've known since we were children, and I went to college with him, an Adventist college, and I found out years later that he's gay. And I always wondered, because he just was not like other guys. I believe some choose that lifestyle, but I really believe that a lot are born into that lifestyle. I think we need to treat them with respect. He did have one affair. He tried to commit suicide because he could never be normal, and he wanted to be normal. He finally, with the help of psychiatrists, just learned to accept himself, but he doesn't practice. He became an Adventist a few years ago and was baptized. And I can call him up and ask him to pray for me. He studies his Bible. He reads Ellen White. But, gay people are lonely. Men in the church will not befriend them. They do have women friends, but so sometimes maybe they need a church of their own.
So I think I can answer your question.
Sure, go
ahead. The Bible doesn't say to hate people, does it? And I didn't say that. It said to hate evil. And I also did indicate in my earlier response that I was proud of my university for having this LGBT care group, which is precisely the kind of response that I think we need to be making within the framework of biblical faithfulness to its teachings on family and sexuality. So I don't think that's certainly not a hateful response, and I think it's a caring response, and I'm proud of my university for doing that, and hope it will lead the way for other institutions in the church to do similar things.
Thank you. We appreciate that clarification. I did realize I stole 4 minutes from the beginning, so I'll give one more. Yes, Don.
Thank you all for participating today. And I can't help but think, I think we all believe that our battle's not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. And we deal with human beings, and Jesus' example was clear. He was not turned away by sinners. He was turned away by people who rejected him. And when he sat with sinners, whether it was the woman caught in adultery, who he showed compassion and exposed the guilt of her accusers, he ultimately said, I don't accuse you. He accepted her and told her, don't sin anymore. My personal belief is, there's discussions of the political spectrum here. I personally believe, after a few years' experience of observation, is the extremes of both political parties today are not a whole lot different from each other. And the biggest issue to me is personal freedom. Whether it's government intrusion, which there's a lot of and has been over the last 8-9 years, a tremendous amount of government intrusion into freedom, or religious intrusion. Both are extremely dangerous. I think equally it's dangerous. There was a discussion about homosexuality. I've got a couple of members of my extended family who are in that lifestyle today. Okay? We accept them. They're treated like anybody else in the family. I don't agree with their lifestyle, but they're human beings on the path and on the journey. I also heard something about that the homosexuality issue will slip away in the shadows at some point. I personally think the opposite is going to happen. You look around this room, there are a few young people helping bring down the average age in this congregation this afternoon, but most of us are older. 20 years from now, when a lot of the younger people who are influenced by the education, particularly the public school system in this country, media, social media, who don't see a problem with that lifestyle at all, roll ahead 20 years. What's going to be the threat to the religious freedom at that point in time? And so I think this is an issue that's not going away, because the evil one sees it as a way to divide human beings against human beings, and also to attack God's original example in the Garden of Eden, as was discussed this morning very appropriately. So I think we have these challenges. I would appreciate the church, because I think sometimes I think we're very close to exposing the religious abuse, but not necessarily the government abuse of personal freedoms in this country as well. Thank you.
Did you want to respond, Brother Steed?
You can differ from... Yes, you can differ...
Is it on?
This is a sign, Lincoln. It's a sign.
I don't mind someone differing, but I'm not saying that immorality is going to disappear. And you can make any number of judgments as to why homosexuality and transvestitism and so on is increasing. I remember very much when I was studying biology. You get mice in a cage and you get them to a certain crowding level and it breaks out spontaneously. I think we're in a society that's under incredible stress. The nuclear family's broken down, and we know that dynamic that feeds into the development and so on. There's many reasons, not necessarily bull. What I believe is we will drift toward where it's not the predominant issue. There'll be as there was in Germany and has been in other countries, a sort of a public morality where we try to clean the deck, but yet don't ask, don't tell, it continues. It's the only way the Catholic Church is going to continue this. They call it child abuse, but it's homosexuality rampant. Like in Australia at the moment, they've got the chief cardinal on trial for what he personally did, and they found that in some orders the abuse rate is as high as 60-70%. It's amazing. Yeah, we're living in a wicked and corrupt world. What we're going to see, though, before it fades away, I believe, in society, you're going to see it accepted in the Adventist Church. Sorry. I was at a meeting, and I do want to say this because it's a public record. I was at a meeting in Canada where we had an Adventist lawyer from the General Conference, our legislative liaison, and a number of others there. And this lawyer, who no longer works there, I knew his views. He stood up and he said, we were wrong on civil rights, we were wrong on women's rights. The day is going to come when we accept practicing gays and their lovers into church membership and church office. Sooner we do this, the better. You know, that's a horrendous statement. But someone that had employment with the church thought they could say it. And it's an open secret. There are people scattered throughout our system who are dedicated to that end. And you think in an age of declining public morality and indifference and the growing moral dissonance within the church that it isn't going to be accepted at some level? Probably never. As an article of faith, we're not going to make a 29th fundamental, but I think it will come in an accepted way, and we shouldn't settle for that or anything else like it lightly. We need to speak up both. We talk about civil justice in the church or justice issues outside the church. Why not in the church? We have an obligation, first the house of faith, then the others. For Adventism to change the world, it needs to make sure that its charter and its community is relatively on the same page. There's always going to be doubters, but we need a revival, we need a reorientation within our church on many issues, religious liberty just as much, if not more than most.
Dr. Miller, Elder Xisto, Dr. Feitosa, and Elder Steed, thank you very much. Have you appreciated our panel discussion? We appreciate you being here. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Let us have a word of prayer to close out our session. Our Father in heaven, you have been here. You have heard our questions, our answers, our projections and our musings, Lord, about this very important issue of religious liberty. Lord, I do pray, I pray for two things. I pray that there would be a revival of intense interest among Seventh-day Adventists in this issue of religious liberty. I pray that we would have a renewed sense, Lord, that indeed this is important, that we must take it seriously, that even our very identity demands that we take it seriously. And Lord, most of all, I pray that there would be an outbreak, a true revival of primitive godliness. We're told that it will come, but I pray, Lord, that not merely seeing the world through religious liberty eyes, but ultimately being able to see them through yours, because you live inside of us and we're filled with your Spirit, walking with you each day. May that revival, Lord, come, and may it come soon. We pray these things in your name. Amen. Our seminar schedule is printed